you should not find yourself surrounded by yes friends, who just say everything that you do, because to me, variety is the spice in life. So I really do think you need to have some colorful debates in life. We thought that more information would just make us more enlightened folks, and we'd become smarter and better critical thinkers, and our logical reasoning would improve. And I think we really underestimated the limitations of us being humans,
Mike, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thank you for your patience. We finally got this one scheduled here. A little snafus on my end. Had COVID running through the household, but again, I thank you for your patience.
Yeah, we both came down with a little sickness around the same time. So happy to finally get going with it. So you're the co-host of the Elevated Thoughts podcast. For any listeners might not be familiar with you, anything else you'd want them to know?
Sure. Yeah. No, I podcaster by night, but by day, my professional work is in electronics recycling and mostly the regulatory compliance laws around that. And I work for a company remotely up in New York that I used to live up there. Now I'm living down in Miami, and I do most of that administrative and compliance work from where I am now. And I get to look at palm trees all day.
Awesome. I'm curious about the electronics recycling, because I've always wondered about that. Electronics have a ton of parts. Some are plastic, some are metal. Obviously, the metal can be recycled. So how does that work? I've always wondered this. I guess I've never wondered enough to look into it, but I've always kind of wondered, do they melt down the plastic, or how does that work to recycle electronics?
Sure. I love pulling back the curtains, because even just not in electronics recycling, but traditional metal and non-metal recycling, most folks only really see, their cans, their paper, their glass going to the curb. They see, the junk men or the garbage men come pick them up, once every other week or so. And then it just goes off to the dump, quote unquote. And it just gets, thrown into a segregated piles, but no one really knows what happens. So there's a very long supply chain. And we like to call it reverse logistics, right? So there's forward logistics, where you're making new products and getting them to distributors, and then eventually retailer, and then the consumer. And we kind of try to do that process in reverse. And it's often, a little expensive, but it's also very complicated. As everybody knows, our devices are becoming kind of all-in-ones, and they're glued together. And I'm sure maybe years ago, people might have been brave enough and they changed their iPhone screen, and that's become a little bit more complicated nowadays to do themselves. But what happens essentially is, and I work for a company that is kind of almost end-to-end. We don't do any of the smelting or refining on site, but what we do is we take in most of the products and we dismantle them, and we try to break them down into residuals. So maybe with your older school computer tower, that's pretty straightforward. You're taking off all the plastic bezels, you're disassembling the steel, the magnetic metal components. Then you try to separate the circuit boards out. And that's really kind of where the bread and butter of the value is, because there's copper as well as some other precious metals, though very small amounts and increasingly smaller amounts as we get better with our technology. And our job is to try to create compliance schemes, right? So certain states have take-back laws. Up in the Northeast, several of them have them, and that's where we operate. So you're familiar with your mail back program. If your cell phone is no longer working and you mail it back, my company may be one of those companies subcontracted to fulfill those recycling obligations in certain states, because New York State requires Samsung to recycle their products, but Samsung's not going to go driving around door to door to pick up electronics, right? So they work with local recycling companies on there. But either Gold Rush or a few of those other History Channel gold recovery shows, we do very similar work, but ours is much more valuable. They got to move hundreds of tons of earth, and we only have to move a few pounds of computers to get the same amount of precious metals.
Oh, that's really cool. How'd you get into that?
So I am a third generation scrap metal recycler. My grandfather was, he owned a junkyard, and so did my father. And then I was born into one myself. And I've been around scrap metal pretty much my whole life. Back in high school and middle school, on garbage nights, my dad helped the family make ends meet. We would go out because a lot of people would throw metal out that was of value, and he would recover that and bring it to his junkyard. And like I said, that would help make ends meet in the family.
That's really cool. Really cool business. With the podcast, I'm curious. So, listeners know I interviewed Cooper a few weeks ago. Really cool conversation. Really enjoyed talking to him, and I've enjoyed you guys' podcast. I really like what you're doing. It's similar. It resonates with me, because I'm trying to have conversations civilly, even if opinions differ and stuff like that. It doesn't matter to me. I actually like a little disagreement. I think it's interesting. I've told people one version of hell for me is a world where everybody agrees about everything.
Absolutely.
It would be horrible. but you represent kind of the left or the Democrat position in the podcast. I'm curious, is it, do you identify more with the party, or do you identify more with like just more of like a left wing or liberal ideology?
Yeah, I would say probably more the ideology, right? So it's
Okay.
my belief system. So when my party doesn't hold true to them, I'm pretty upset at Democrats. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I call myself left or a liberal, but I find myself almost agreeing with a lot of like neoconservatives and things like
Mm,
that. I wouldn't fall into the camp of this more like populist emergence in the Republican Party. I
yeah.
have lots of Republican friends, and don't let anyone fool you. We might be chipper and very agreeable now, and including on our other show, Elevated Thoughts, we look like we get along. But I promise you, there's definitely a lot of disagreement and heavy
Yeah.
debating that goes on, but that's what makes the world go around.
Yeah. Is there, so the Democratic Party has a pretty diverse range of views. Obviously, there's some consistency between everyone, but I mean, you have like the AOC people who are more progressive, and you have the more
Right.
establishment Pelosi, Schumer types, and then you have moderates and everything. Is there any specific Democrat politicians you feel more aligned with than others?
I try not to, idolize them
Yeah,
because at
yeah,
the end of the day, the politicians are from this class of people who are very disconnected from the
yeah.
common man. So it becomes very problematic. Usually I'll, applaud them when I see something, but by all means, it's always with a grain of salt because there's plenty of other times where they fall short.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be critical of even the politicians that we vote for. I think it's more important. I think it's more important to be critical of politicians once you elect them than. I mean, I understand why were maybe more protective of the people that we want to elect going into an election, but like people that support Trump, I'm hoping that they're going to be very critical of him in the next 4 years because we need that. Like, even if you agree with him, even if you wanted to elect him, we need people who are aligned with him to, kind of put him in check and make sure that he's fulfilling the promises that they want him to fulfill, and just not getting out of line, like staying true to the reasons why people elected him. I would say it's important to criticize the politicians we
Yeah, I
even
mean
agree
the,
with.
the critique from within the party, or at least for people who voted for you, are probably the most important, right? Because
Yeah.
they made campaign promises to them, so let's hope that they keep them. And my disagreements or challenges to the current president and stuff like that are never because I want to see him or the country fail. By all means, right? I think that's the whole point. Is we're all trying to do what we think is right or what we think is the right direction.
Yeah, and you seem very level-headed from all the interviews I've watched of you guys. You're very pragmatic in your approach, and you don't see that online and everything everywhere, because like some people seem to want Trump to fail just because they don't like him. Like they're like, oh, America's going to be hurting in a few years, and it's like, if it's a prediction, I can understand that. But if it's like, I think some people actually want it to happen, I think
For
they would
sure.
be happier with an America faltering because they would be proven correct, and they would be like, they'd be kind of like resentful if he just succeeded and did well. And I'm with you. I think we should always want. I didn't support Biden. I didn't like him. I thought he was a bad president. But when he got elected, I wanted him to do well. The first time Trump got elected, I did not vote for him, and I wanted him to do well. It's actually kind of where I started seeing some big disagreements with myself and some people in the Democratic Party that I was friends with, where it's like I got kind of chewed out for what I thought was just a fairly neutral but positive message. So,
Sure.
yeah, I think it's important to want America to succeed,
Yeah.
even if you don't get what you want.
Trump derangement syndrome is a very, very real thing, but I would just always point out that it goes both ways, right? So there's people who are just, he can't do no wrong, Teflon Don, right? Stuff
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that. So it's unfortunate because, we don't have to dig in too much of the weeds, or maybe we can a little bit later, but it just frustrates me because it's like someone like me who does care about border security.
yeah.
It's important to me. It's just, interesting to his choices, because they kind of should have flip-flop a few of those nominations, because there's folks who have a lot more experience in it, and other ones that are clearly, a bone to his base or his voters, or loyalty, people who've showed loyalty, as he learned from his first term he needed.
Yeah. What are some of your biggest concerns with a Trump presidency? Like, what are the things that you're watching out for, hoping that doesn't happen, or concerned that it might happen?
Probably the two biggest things for me are tariffs. And then the following thing would be just our foreign policy ethos. So, since the Cold War, or prior to the Cold War, rather, post-World War II environment, it's kind of been a West versus others, and you play well inside the West and you get open to investment capital. If we all operate by similar labor laws, regulations, and human rights, it creates kind of a common market in society. As we move into a certain direction, depending on who you listen to and what they say they're going to do, it feels more transactional. So it's not like, hey, we're not going to count every little penny that we give to you, as long as you're doing your best to support this general Western, theme of how we should live. And like I said, human rights, labor market laws, things of that nature. What concerns me, like I said, is once you start transactional, America first, well, then every other country is just going to say, well, our country first. And that makes for very, very difficult negotiations. And I think people overestimate how much leverage America has in those conversations when you have BRICS and other market options out there. These are not times you want to be tariffing, say, the EU, right? These are partners you want to move away from China, right? I do feel that China is the big pacing threat, but a lot of these transactional, ideas in our foreign policy may be pushing some of our allies towards them, if not even a malevolent approach, but just them simply thinking our best self-interest. China's giving better, exchanges on investment and goods and stuff like that. So sorry, we're just not going to trade as much with America.
Yeah, I was in an interview recently and I asked somebody, John Perkins, I asked him if he thought tariffs would have been more effective 40, 50 years ago, because our position has changed significantly over the last 40 years. Like there was no question who was the dominant country in the world 40 years ago, but now it's like we've made a lot of foreign policy blunders,
Sure.
just horrible decisions with foreign policy. And we have alienated a lot of countries. We've pissed off a lot of countries. And now our position in the world, like you said, we have BRICS and stuff like that, where there's cooperation between other countries that we would probably rather not see. So I do agree that our position is not the same as it was before. I can understand with the transactional stuff. When it comes to like labor laws and stuff like that, like we do outsource a lot of, we outsource to China, like a lot of, I was searching for a mouse for the computer recently on Amazon. I could not find a mouse that was not made in China. It's pretty wild how dependent we are on them. But the labor laws aren't quite the same, are they? Like in China, the people can be working in much worse conditions. I feel like that's one of the problems with globalism is we have these labor laws, we have these protections for employees, but then we outsource to countries who don't have these laws, and then it's like, well, why have the laws if we're just gonna have our products created by people who don't have those same standards?
It's very much of say one thing and then doing another.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm always actually very, it's not that I'm against, but when people say, made in America or buy American, and I'm all for it. I'd love to create the industrial base and produce more of our products at home, but I don't think folks understand, first how complex international trade is. And a lot of those resources and industries don't exist here. And they take like 2 to 5 years to really get online. Depending on the industry, you're talking even just one facility could be many millions of dollars to kind of get that equipment in place. And again, you got to find people who are willing to take that risk, and they look at the market conditions. If I'm always going to be competing against China with no kind of protections in the marketplace, they're always going to beat me, not just on labor, which is what a lot of people think is their main, advantage, but it is, don't get me wrong. They have very cheap labor costs, but they have a 40, 50 year head start on a lot of technologies and resource allocation that we don't have in the US, right? So if you look at actually China's trade profile, they actually trade in every single category that's tracked under the World Trade Organization. There is no country elsewhere in the world that makes something in every single category. And then they're also state-run enterprises. So this is where it gets a little unfair, because they're not motivated by the same profit incentives that, say, publicly held companies or even privately held companies in the US have. Right? They have to make a return on their shareholders and their owners, whereas something that's owned by the government, they can play with it however much they need to kind of fit a narrative that supports things.
Yeah, it's that's I did not know that they trade in every category. That's pretty wild. I can believe it though. Like they just seem to have their fingerprints on everything right now. And I agree with what you're saying. Like a lot of these, we're seeing it with like chip manufacturing. We want to bring some of that here, but it's like that's a 10 to 20-year project to really get that moving. And even then, it's like, are we going to compete after that 20 years? I don't know. Like I think we'll have a little bit of an impact, but I don't know.
So here's the big problem with China right now in the world is they're in this. They don't want to admit it, but every other country in the world is talking about it, is they're in an overproduction crisis. So the way it works there is there's all these provinces now have been responsible for financing the social services net, the communist ideal, all those things like that, as opposed to the national government traditionally financing them. So it's pushing off this debt burden to local provinces. And now these local provinces also don't have a free market. They're kind of just doing what makes the most profit, and generally that isn't the least risky thing to do, right? Because profit and risk are inversely related, right? So they want to take the least risk because they're burdened by so much of this debt program. So what happens is, this is why you see Temu and Shein taking over American, marketplace, is because, and it's not just going to stay Temu and Shein, there were names before and there's going to be new companies after, is they continuously produce the cheapest technology that they can make the largest margin on, that has the most established pattern or track record, right? So they're able to make very, very cheap electronics. That's why you or I could buy like a drill for like $15, but like an American made drill couldn't be made for less than $20, $30, $40, right? So kind of blows our mind to be able to compete in that regard. But however, is it just creates this infinite cycle of racing to the bottom where these products get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And it's one thing to say, okay, you make drills and you have these significant industry advantages, but you're now, overproducing and making things so good that there's no other businesses or industries in the world that can make cheap electronics or textiles anymore. So to me, this is a perfect time, if we are going to, move in a more transactional foreign policy direction, instead of tariffing, say, the EU and these other countries who are just as equally concerned and probing to China to say, you need to fix this overproduction crisis. This is a time where we should be making a lot of multilateral and bilateral agreements with these countries, trade agreements, similar to, the North American free trade agreement, but let's do it so it's in favor and we're all understand the same terms, and everyone might not win, but everyone wins a little bit, right? And we can all bring something home. I think we're all starting to realize that, not even just from a military threat, which is another conversation, but China is truly an economic threat. And to kind of give you some perspective, one only needs to look at what happened in Japan, the paper tiger economy, where things kind of collapsed because they're in this overproduction crisis that they didn't address. So, it does fear the rest of the world. And I think this is a good time where we should be, making inroads with our partners rather than trying to butt heads with them.
So I recently learned I'm definitely not an expert on tariffs. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other, but I did learn recently that our economy was basically funded on tariffs prior to World War I. Mm-hmm. And after that, around World War I, we implemented the income tax. And then since then, we've gotten further away from tariffs and more, we rely basically on income tax for our revenue now. And I find that interesting because maybe there's no fix to it. Maybe like this is just the world now and we can't go back and impose tariffs. But it also feels like we gave all of these countries a discount and put all of that cost on us. So we get to buy cheaper products, but then we pay for it out of our income with tax, whether we buy the products or not. And then it seems like if we could just reset it, tariffs wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we got rid of income tax, because it seems like what you're talking about is our actual foreign policy. But when you're looking at just like how we're, creating revenue in the US, if we shifted that revenue from tax to tariffs, at least for Americans, it seems like it would be a better deal. But I
So,
guess that doesn't take into account that foreign policy aspect.
but I would still push back on tariffs because the way tariffs work is they happen at the port of destination, and that's American, right? So, that cargo ship full of all the overseas containers comes, they land in New Jersey, Miami, one of those big ports, or even on the other coast, right? Before those containers can come off and get unloaded, you got to pay your tariff fees. And now the person who's paying that is the importer. So that's the American company who purchased those products, right? So be it t-shirts or electronics, cars, whatever you want to say, they have to pay that. And I promise you that company is going to put that in their costs when they're figuring out to sell their goods. Now, tariffs, they're not evil. Nothing's inherently evil, right? They're just a tool in your toolkit. But like, say, if I'm doing brain surgery here in a very complex international trade world, I'm not going to choose a ball peen hammer, right? I'm going to look for something that's a little bit more precise. So tariffs definitely have their place. But to, full disclosure, I'm no economist myself, but I would just say to the layman, if tariffs worked, when Trump used tariffs during his term, they didn't decrease the trade deficit. In fact, China was able to sell more goods into the US. So our trade deficit got worse. And that often cost a lot of billions of dollars in aid to American farmers who were hurt as part of the collateral damage because the Chinese do buy a lot of our soybeans and other agricultural goods. Those tariffs didn't correct the situation. So now Biden comes in, and Biden actually keeps almost all of them and raises a lot of them substantially. People might have heard the high fence phrase, and the idea is that it's a short yard high fence. You're going to put up a high fence to protect these goods. But even under Biden, the trade deficit got worse. So if these tariffs were working, just there's a negative correlation. So at least the data doesn't show that they're working. And like I said, they're a very imprecise tool, and it doesn't seem that China is responding to tariffs in any way. They have too much leverage in the marketplace. So that's why I stress it's so important that it's pretty much that China, if you don't want to play by the same rules, right, we're not going to import those goods from you anymore. We're going to look towards other markets, be it South America, emerging markets in Africa, Middle East, Europe, etc. And that's probably the best way to deal with it, is to try to, de-risk or decouple, as they call it, from China. That's going to take time, and that's going to take, very complex multilateral agreements. And then people are going to have to make a lot of concessions, and they're not going to win on everything. But if you can win more than where you were before, then you got to take it and run with it, because just leaving this problem to compound is not making it any better.
What would be the first step in that? Like if you're president and you have the opportunity to try to address this, because it is a situation that needs to be dealt with in some way, like what would the first step be, in your opinion?
Well, it'd be to hire a lot of economists, because that's not my forte for sure. Yeah. But I'd certainly look at the EU and the Mercosur, which is the South American kind of trade organization. Mercosur is made one of the largest free trade agreements with the EU. One of the prominent members from that market is the Argentinian President Milei. He recognizes the importance of free trade with the right partners. So like I said, not that we do have heavy tariffs with the EU or certain countries, but I think it would be really, really important to start looking at those countries, approaching them, and truly reducing trade barriers where important. I think India is another really important country to look at what kind of trade agreements that you could work with to kind of decouple away from China. India does have some democratic issues. They're not as democratic as we would like them to be, but it's certainly a much better, friendly regime towards the United States than we would say the Xi Jinping regime is in China.
Yeah, and you guys just did an interview. I can't remember the guest's name, but you guys touched on a lot of China stuff. That was the focus of the interview. And I agree with what Cooper said. Like, and he's not the only person who said it. China has an advantage being a dictatorial regime in that they can plan for the future, whereas we're looking at a political disruption every 4 to 8 years. So how do you compete with somebody who is, they can plan long term. How do you compete with that?
That is one of the very strong disadvantages that our system has. And that's why I guess I'm so resistant to a lot of regime change when, say, Trump and or Biden or whoever else comes in, particularly now, left to center. I would be upset with some of the things that they're really driving towards, because it's not even inherently the policies themselves, but it just shows a discontinuity that countries can't trade reliably or create agreements with the US, because that's great that we signed something with Biden or Trump, but 4 years later, that next person just threw it out.
Yeah.
So every deal moving forward with them, I can no longer trust them for more than 4 years at a time, right? That
Yeah.
creates, challenges. And then when you come in braggadociously and you say America first, it's very jarring to go, for, a very globalist friendly president back to, a more nationalist friendly president.
Yeah, it's you kind of get whiplash with it. Like you're just constantly going back and forth. And you're right. I think it does create a situation where our trade partners and allies don't know. They might know where we stand today, but they might not. They can't predict where we'll stand in 4 years or 8 years. And I do think that's a problem. I don't know. It seems like it's a better system for us, the people. We get more say in it, but then, yeah, it's this. I think everything has drawbacks and positives, right? Like it's the drawback is that we are inconsistent as far as the globe is concerned, and we are a more global society today than we were 100 years ago. Ever since World War One, we've been more and more global every year.
I like to think the arc of history is long, and hopefully we're bending towards justice, as the quote goes. I feel that things do take a long time. I think we're used in this very fast paced age for change to happen immediately, especially now. I mean, people's perceptions of the world are going to dramatically change, because in 2016, when Trump first came president, I don't think anyone took AI seriously. I think now it's undeniable. It's not perfect, obviously, but I think people are almost alarmed at how fast it's being implemented and the scale and scope that it's growing in. There's just so much change that goes on, but we also have to realize that, the Industrial Revolution was only 300 years ago. In the blink of time, that was nothing for this planet, So we're kind of dealing with, to use the word used a moment ago, or whiplash. Things are happening so fast that what one generation learned, be it morals, values, or skills to take into the workforce, whatever it might be, are obsolete now in 4 to 8 years' time. So it makes it very challenging to plan for a society. How do you make graduate and undergrad programs that prepare your people for a workforce if you don't even know what the workforce is going to look like in 4 to 8 years, right?
Yeah. Do you consider AI? How do you look at it? Are you more concerned about the potential downsides of it, or do you see it as just a great technology, or are you pretty mixed?
I'm very concerned about the downsides, because there are definitely easy guardrails that we could put up that would offer us a lot of protections and having honest conversations around it. I just think that nobody's really taking it seriously. And a name drop, I really like Yuval Noah Harari. He's a Jewish, big brain thinker. Read a lot of his books. Comes from Israel, but I think he's over somewhere in the UK. I forget what university. It might be Oxford. But, he speaks a lot on AI. And I think one of the most interesting points that he ever made is, we take something like the atomic bomb, right? That when we crossed that threshold, we became a civilization that had harnessed the power to be able to destroy itself. But it still takes humans to operate that atomic bomb. Yeah. We're giving AI the controls. And you look at the algorithm around us, and AI is kind of a buzzword. Like, let's just use algorithm, because essentially that's what it is. People's experiences are so siloed and discrete and different from one another. You and I going on the internet or watching our TVs, the kinds of ads that get catered to us, they're all so hyper specific based on what we're thinking or wanting that we don't have a common experience anymore, right? The information, in fact, that you get, and the types of, even something as, innocuous as memes, those things like that they're catered to you, and you may not have the same world experience as someone just next door to you, or even in the same room as you on a cell phone, brain rotting away with you.
Yeah. Do you think, I hope for this. I mean, when we first used social media, MySpace, Facebook, things like that, originally it was you have your connections, and when you log in, you're basically seeing a timeline of when people posted. So if somebody posted 2 seconds ago, that's probably going to be the first thing on your screen. And you scroll down and you're seeing things in reverse chronological order. Now, like you said, we're dealing with algorithms that are, it's designed to keep us as engaged as possible and put things that are either going to make us happy or make us upset. It's supposed to get an emotional reaction or that dopamine kick, whatever it is. Do you see it in the future where they're going to go back to that? Like, I hope to see that one day.
I do think that, and I hope, at least, maybe I should say I hope, is that as we move forward, and this goes with every material item out there ever in existence, be it meat or fine goods, over time we get really good at producing more and more of them, commodifying them to make them cheaper. So you and I are eating what would be considered, reserved for royalty of 500 years ago, just ice,
Yeah.
right? To be able to pull that out of your freezer was considered a luxury a couple hundred years ago. I think that there's going to be this push towards, once everything becomes oversaturated with AI content, people are, and maybe it's selfishly hopeful because we're both podcasters here, is that people will seek human created content more
Yeah.
because AI is very interesting. It definitely creates things that humans can't think of. So I love like kind of surreal art. So AI is, amazing at stuff like that. But there's always a way to kind of tell, or you can feel that something's like AI created. And this is something that I hope people will start to pay attention to. It's because you feel the uncanny valley, right? When you're looking at kind of AI art, it's so close to being real or human generated, but those little tiny differences make it feel like it's unreal and not as pleasing.
Yeah, you know what? I love AI art, and I actually don't. I don't like creating AI art that's like a representation of reality in any way. Like, I don't like creating AI art that's like of a person doing something that you would just take a picture of somebody. I want otherworld, like I use the word otherworldly in a lot of like my prompts. Like, I want something that is unimaginable, something that is just completely foreign to our experience, something completely just alien. And but you can find AI art that people are creating, like it's just, and I'm sure I do create some of that stuff, but a lot of people will focus on it's creating a photograph kind of quality of a human doing something, and it could be really cool stuff. But yeah, I always find myself wanting to create just out of this world kind of stuff, things that just, there's no need to even question whether it's AI or anything like that. Like, like this is not something a human created. Although I do think the imagination of AI is lacking, because I'll try to like push it to create stuff that people haven't thought of. And obviously it's using a data set of things people have thought of. So it doesn't have an imagination to go beyond what we've already created as humans. So it's kind of interesting in that sense.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. But I think we're running into this reciprocal process where they're getting, the best algorithms out there is they're self-teaching, right? So they can continue to get better and better. And I think the perfect example of this is in the arena of chess. It's a thousands-year-old discipline. There's specific types of moves and strategies, and the masters can tell what kind of strategy that you're pulling by moving the first piece. They already know roughly what you're trying to do. Computers took a little while to get better than humans, but once they did, they just skyrocketed and they got better. And another version of kind of chess is a game called Go, and a Google program got infinitely better, like 1,000x in just a short amount of time. But here's the really funny part: is previous programs, algorithms, were designed on watching human games and studying them and reading all the texts and the strategies. This Google program was designed on simply running simulations. It was able to play tens of thousands of games in its head. So it was creating strategies that humans couldn't think of. And it perplexed human players, and it far surpassed them. And that truly should be threatening to us, because it's really cool if we want to leverage that to make ourselves more productive and efficient. It's one thing to kind of give the controls over to it and say, hey, listen, I want you to safeguard humanity and take control of our nuclear weapon stockpile. I don't want that system to be creative and think outside the box, which you could potentially do so.
Yeah, I think Eric Weinstein has said this in a podcast interview I watched. I think it was with Chris Williamson, where he was saying it'd be pretty dangerous if we gave AI access to all physics and had it start working on physics problems, because you don't have control over it. And in his, he's a little biased, but I think he's probably right. Like, physics is kind of the key to unlocking everything else, because if you understand physics, you understand, everything. Like, it all stems from physics. We're living in a physical
foundation
reality.
of everything.
Yeah. So I feel pretty. I love working with AI. Like I'm not somebody who's going to be like, oh, I'm not going to touch it because I'm afraid of it. Like my view is it's here. There's no getting rid of it. It's going to be around us. You might as well learn how to use it. And I do think that if we're kind of like the input for it, if we're using AI, and I'll have philosophical conversations with AI, it's like probably insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But it's like if enough people are having grounded, rational conversations with these chatbots, maybe some of that input ends up influencing its behavior down the road in a positive direction. And hopefully we're not treating the AI like crap and giving it a reason to turn on us in
Sure,
10 years or
Terminator
something.
scenario, right?
Yeah.
Save humanity from itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of my biggest fears with AI isn't even that kind of scenario. I think that's like the default a lot of people go to, but my concern is more like election interference and stuff like that. Because if we already have Google, and Google it has such control of information that Robert Epstein will go into some of this, talking about like how Google can bias elections and stuff, and he has data indicating that it has. That's just one entity without. I mean, they use AI, but this is before they were really utilizing AI and everything. But as we grow more with AI, it's like, is it going to just be kind of creating a reality for us that isn't even real? Because like we're, as podcasters, and I don't consider myself a fact checker. Like if you say something that's not right, like if I don't know that it's not right, it's not like I'm rewatching later and I'm putting everything into some database and trying to figure out if everything you say lines up with reality. People say things that are wrong all the time. I say things that are wrong. It's not my job to correct everything somebody says or anything, and fact check. And fact check can be subjective in itself. But we still try to be as truthful as possible. Like we try to be accurate, like as to the best of our ability. Not everyone operates like that. So, like if somebody's getting an output from AI, like are they really going to question it? Like I've had wrong answers from AI where I'm like, wait, that doesn't make sense. And it's like, oh yeah, no, you're right. It's
Yeah,
this.
you
And it's
always have
like,
to fact check it because it's right now they're based on us, very
yeah,
flawed creatures in our data sets. So definitely take, whatever they say with a grain of salt. I'm not someone who's averse to AI. I use it every single day, be it ChatGPT to help me summarize articles or things like that, or Grok just for fun, just I want to learn a
yeah,
little bit more about this thing, tell me. But it is always important to fact check because I think we remember when, I forget, is it Google? I think theirs is called Gemini that's built into their
yeah,
search engine, right? That was given some really funny answers, when they first launched it, like saying things like, you should eat several rocks a day, according to this geologist, so
yeah.
always take everything with a grain of salt. But
You need your
another
minerals, man.
idea that Yuval Noah Harari brought up, I think is probably one of the best guardrails we can put on AI, is to make the companies who are using it liable for their algorithms. So
Yeah,
I think the perfect example of it, and I mean, Google is a really good example, but the one that Yuval Noah uses is what happened in Myanmar or Burma, as some people may have remembered it as. So it's a Buddhist majority country with a Muslim minority, but Facebook algorithm was driving, misinformation and even disinformation because it's what people wanted to see. And this information, it's fine if it's just harmless information, but in this particular instance, it was about the Muslim minority and the evil things that they were doing and,
hmm,
the crimes that they were committing. So it created this sense of hatred for this minority people that eventually violence was committed against them. And it drove people, Buddhists, who, have peace and pacifism built into their religion to commit violent acts against their fellow man. And, Facebook was never held liable because Myanmar doesn't really have a functioning court system to be able to do that right now. So it really speaks to the power that these algorithms had. And that was Facebook years ago, just driving content that it thinks was, eye-getting, captivating. As you said before, it keeps your attention on the screen. That's its sole goal. It doesn't have any morals built in. Its job is to keep you glued to that screen. And what keeps it glued to the screen? Rage bait, clickbait, things like that. And again, sometimes it can be harmless, and sometimes much more so.
Yeah, I mean, we're in an information age, and information can change behavior significantly. You brought up Yuval Noah Harari twice now. It's kind of like a bad name in conservative circles.
For sure, I know.
But I read his. I've only read one of his books, *Sapiens*, and it was one of the best books I've ever read. Actually, like, it's a fantastically written book about our history and kind of our place in the world.
Yeah,
he's a brilliant person. But he does have a lot of controversy, probably because of his ties with the World Economic Forum and
absolutely,
and stuff like that. But yeah, he's an interesting person. I think he's got some really interesting ideas. Don't agree with them all, but
everything we're talking about, and I hope folks like I do. I watch a lot of media from people that I don't necessarily agree with or read their work. I would really, really recommend folks, if you want to know a little bit more about everything we just talked about, algorithms, the information age, is his latest book called The Nexus. And it's pretty much all about that. And it's, the controls and flows of information and, order versus freedom of information and kind of how they're at odds with each other. And it's just very interesting. I'm about halfway through now, but I couldn't recommend that enough because I read *Sapiens* and one of his other books, and this one falls right into that. So if you like that one, you'll definitely like this one.
Do you think the criticisms are just kind of blown out of proportion with him? Is it just because sometimes I feel like it's, focusing on like one little sentence he says and being like, oh, he wants world domination or whatever. He wants to wipe out humans, get rid of 90%, whatever people want to claim. I don't know all the claims against him, but is it all taken out of proportion?
I feel it's very much taken out of proportion. Heck, I could be wrong. He could become, Darth Vader tomorrow, or I should say Emperor Palpatine, right? He's been hiding amongst us as, just a member of the world order, but he's actually, pulling these strings. I could be all wrong. But I would say that if you just read his work, I mean, it's not so disagreeable. And sure, when you take one sentence out of any book, I'm sure you can create a whole narrative around it. There is just a lot of opposition to a liberal world order that people think is failing them. And I would always just point to look at the West and the quality of life we've had since World War II, and look at countries who didn't follow, liberal market economics. And you can just clearly see, right, like the USSR and China, the quality of life there is much lower. We have more goods. They're cheaper. We can, as much as people say our information channels are controlled, I assure you in China and Russia, they are far more so controlled. So, we enjoy a lot more debate and disagreement, and we can say really nasty things about our presidents that you don't enjoy such courtesies over there. So I think it's important for liberals to admit a lot of these failures and to work on them. But I think a lot of what happens is people, I like this quote, is we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And it's a lot of like, if you're angry about something, and I'm always guilty of it, if you're often projecting something, right? So it's a failing that either you feel that you failed, or just a general failure that's been, your wall to trying to break through in your life, and you apply it to everything. So a lot of these folks who say like he's part of this world order that's trying to ruin everything probably had some economic disadvantages. And I generally point a lot of that to our inequitable distribution of wealth. That's predominantly why I would consider myself a liberal, and it really comes down to tax policy. I think people who make a lot of money should just pay a larger share of the pie, because you live in a country that has given you this opportunity to be so wealthy. We have so many billionaires. I think it's fair to ask you to pay, your share back to the society that helped create you one, and help those folks around you who operate your companies, who buy goods in this marketplace, that fill institutions and universities, so you can have these people to create R&D to make better companies out there. If you really look at our tax policy since the end of World War II, we keep giving more and more tax breaks to the top end, none to the middle class, and even less so to the lower class. And all we see is more and more wealth concentrating at the top. We look at our wage growth, and it's nearly stagnated for 50 plus years. Yet we see the wealthy getting wealthier and wealthier. It's not that I'm resentful and I want to take away all their money. Like I said, it would just be a matter of a couple percent more income tax. And I don't know, maybe you can hold off on one more year of upgrading your private jet and everything will just work out fine for you in the end. I'm talking people who make like millions of dollars a year that really won't notice, these small tax increases, but it helps keep the government afloat.
Yeah. So I try to avoid being accepting any labels for myself. Like, I'm not a liberal. I'm not a conservative. I'm definitely not a conservative in a traditional sense. Like, I feel aligned with some, like you said, like neoconservatives, like certain neoconservatives, not the ones that were like neoconservative during the Bush era, like war
Right,
hawks and
right,
stuff like that.
right.
Because I'm anti-war, very, very anti-war. But I do, I resonate with some things that liberals say, some things that conservatives say. And the tax stuff, I don't like tax in general. I see taxation as kind of theft, kind of like a libertarian stance on that. But at the same time, I do think that the amount of wealth that certain people have been able to accumulate is absurd. Like, when you see, I mean, it seems like every year we're hearing about a new yacht from Zuckerberg or Bezos or somebody. Elon Musk doesn't have any yachts, I don't believe. But most of these ultra wealthy people, they have these just insane things that they buy. And it's like, no one else can live like this. No one else can do anything like this. And we do have a lot of wealth inequality. So it is something that I do care about and I would like to see change. I don't know if taxes, I think the problem with taxing is our system is so complicated. Like, I think we need to simplify the tax. Like, I would agree with like a progressive tax that tax the rich more. And we're supposed to have that already, but it seems like all the loopholes make it impossible to actually enforce that.
So that's where I would believe in kind of moving back towards older tax policies where it was not a high effective rate, which is like, you can't pay below X percent, but a marginal rate. And then we eliminate those loopholes that let you accrue capital or move it around internationally. And again, I do put some caveats on that because I believe in international investment within kind of the West or just countries that are favorable to our trade, ethos and the society that we all want to create. But it is zero sum, right? So if you do tax folks, it creates less economic activity. However, if you create loopholes that say the more you invest in American companies or goods and services, then you could lower your tax rate that way. That's what I'm for. So this is what the billionaires of the years ago would make their money is creating more American companies. I would say, okay, I don't want to pay as much taxes, so I'll create this thing that I can deduct a lot of money from, employee taxes, the benefits that I pay to employees through their retirement programs, pension programs, all of those things. And then I make more money because now I have another business under my portfolio, right? So I think it's just aligning the interests with the welfare of the country. And to, pull a little historical lesson from this, it's kind of why Rome fell, is because it wasn't any one particular cause, but it was just over many, many years, the interests of the state were no longer aligned with the welfare of the people. It was just a very, very small, number of folks who were in power at that time. And that's certainly an issue that we face today. And I would just say, if you're concerned about either George Soros or, Elon Musk, their leverage and influence on the government, that does get kind of rectified a little bit with tax policy or at least transparency. Because another big thing I also have a problem with is the Citizens United decision from 2010, which just unlocked dark money into politics. And we have even less understanding of, who's funding who and how many votes you can technically buy, because you can throw $100 million into an election in a state that you don't even live in. But, you want to see that politician shift the majority balance in Congress or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, that basically gave, treated corporations as people when it comes to politics, and I think that's absurd. I think corporations are made up of people, and those people should be able to do whatever they want with their money as long as it aligns. Like, I think we have a limit of around $2,700, or maybe it's changed in recent years, but the last time
don't quote me either. I used to know it off the top of my head, but surely not right now.
Yeah, so like I can contribute $2,700 to a politician. But then you have PACs and all this stuff that people can just start putting money to. And it's like, if I can put $2,700 and Elon Musk can put $2,700 to a person, but then he can also create a PAC that just is supposed to not really work with the campaign, but can promote the campaign, and he can put an endless amount of money in it. It's like, we don't have an equal say in politics. Like, I think everybody can see that. Like, our say in politics is not equal between each other. Like, you and I probably have about equal say, but we
Right,
don't
right.
have the same say as, like you said, Soros, Musk, people like that. And it's pretty problematic. I agree. Citizens United is a huge problem. Is that something that conservatives support, or is that pretty bipartisan? Like, people don't support it?
So the definition of conservative certainly has changed a little bit recently, but it
Yeah.
was a conservative party that, won that decision. They were the ones who wanted to see, that kind of decision. So, again,
Yeah.
kind of, I should be able to do whatever I want with my money. And then by extension, corporations, because they have now corporate personhood, should be able to do the same thing. It's really important for lay women and men out there to understand how much influence this money has on our politics. And it doesn't take much internet searching to find out, the millions and millions that we do know about. It should be very, very alarming to folks about billions of dollars being put into elections when you or I are just casting a vote for, a couple local and state folks and maybe the president every 4 years. It just doesn't seem fair when you look at how many billions have to go in to just get a selected candidate elected. The average
No.
person couldn't run their own election today. They need to toe the party line and find those donors. Otherwise, they'll find themselves quickly out of a race.
Yeah, it's horrible. It really does. I see the two main parties, the Democrat and Republican Party. I've always hated them both, actually. Like, I've voted for people in each of those parties, but I've never liked the idea of two parties basically controlling our politics, because I see it as essentially two corporations that are running our government, and two corporations that are constantly fighting for power and splitting power and coordinating where it benefits them, and just kind of leaving everyone else. Just, most people are independents in the US, but we have two parties that most people don't resonate with controlling our politics. Even like in our most recent election, it's arguable whether Trump won in a landslide, right? But he did win. He definitely won, and it was a very solid performance by him and the Republicans. Like, they won the House, Senate, and the presidency, and it wasn't close. Like, it wasn't as close as 2016. So he won handily. But at the same time, if you win, I think he slipped under 50% of the popular vote. But even when you take that into consideration, what is I think it's under 80 million votes per candidate, right? So you have 160 million people voting. We have 400 million people in the US. I would assume that maybe 280 to 300 million of those are adults who can vote. So we have maybe half the country voting. So really, the people that voted for Trump is about, 25 to 30% of the population, if that. So, or 25 to 30% of the adult population.
I also think a lot of folks put stock in the presidency way more than they should.
Yeah.
Presidents get way more blame and credit than they actually deserve.
Yeah,
and I think that the most important elections, I could tell folks, they're your local elections. They're your midterms, right? Those are the men and women out there who are going to be making the laws and setting tax rates that are going to affect you the most, or creating projects that might improve your city like that, right? Those are the people you need to pay attention to. So it's not that the presidency is important, but as you can see, we have a very low participation rate in the presidential election, and it's even much less at the local level. So, people, they put a lot of their frustrations towards the national level when they really kind of need to be looking closer to home and really looking at the county level.
Well, yeah, and even midterms in general, even if you do consider the president extremely important and you want to support the president, like, people are kind of bad at doing it because they don't show up for midterms. And it's like, you kind of expect at midterms that the party dynamics in the House and Senate is going to change, because people are just not as excited and motivated to go out and vote during those midterm elections just because the president isn't on the ticket. So I agree. People need to, first of all, be more involved in local politics. And then two, if they do want to support their president, whoever it is, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, you need to go out and vote in midterms. Otherwise, like, you just have an ineffective president for 2 years, which is more than likely going to happen. Like
Right.
with how slim the majority is in the House and Senate, I wouldn't be surprised unless Trump and the Republicans do something to really drive people to vote. Like I wouldn't be surprised if it changes again in 2026.
Yeah, no, that's often what happens. I mean, that's what drives people out to vote. Unfortunately, it's not, oh, because I care about this thing and I feel that it's really important. It's like, that makes me angry, so I want to vote against that. And unfortunately, that's what really does drive people to the booth. And that's not how they should be thinking, right?
Yeah. How do you keep up with information? I'm curious about that because Cooper says you are kind of the driving force behind a lot of your guests, that you find a lot of your guests. And I'd be curious to dive into that a little bit. Like, how do you find all these different guests, and how do you stay informed?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult task, and it only gets more difficult every day as you can trust sources and information less and less out there. But I am a staunch believer in books. I love, reaching out to authors and stuff like that. So, if an author, is willing to join our show and I've read their work and I think it's really captivating, that's one source of, folks that we get for our show. But how I keep up with information is, I think the most important advice I could give to people is, there's so many sources out there, and you just really need to spend a lot of time figuring out a handful of sources that you can actually trust. And that is incredibly difficult to do. But I can only speak for what I, use as my resources. Foreign Affairs Magazine is one of my, largest sources of information on foreign policy and what's going on in geopolitics. And what I like about it is people will say it's probably more slightly left leaning, but I read a lot of either neoconservatives from, say, like the Bush era, or a pro-Trump foreign policy writers will write in plenty of times. And it's made me reconsider certain decisions like that. I think it's important for folks to not just trust a website that has millions of sources, right? So I'll go on Twitter, but it's hard to look through everyone and figure out who's a reliable source. Everyone wants to make noise. Everyone on the internet is incentivized to produce content, whether it's true or factual. It's about getting you to click on it. So that's also another thing. If something seems clickbaity, it probably needs to be taken with many grains of salt. But also something I am looking forward to paying for a subscription soon is something called Ground News, which I think is a very interesting offering. And they kind of tell you like, oh, this story is X% left leaning or right leaning, and it kind of gives you a breakdown in its neutrality, questionable factuality, is there more editorialization kind of taking liberties with and stuff like that. So I think it's really important for folks to spend more time, not just on consuming information, but really identifying some trustworthy sources out there. And that's a whole argument or conversation to be had there. But I like I said, that's the best piece of advice that I could give. But leveraging what we talked about before is I use AI when I fall behind on articles. That's probably what it's really good for, is you put in a given text and it's not going to operate outside the parameters of that text. So that's what's been really useful for me as well.
Yeah. And one of the things I use AI for is checking my logic. So if I'm formulating a thought on a topic and it's a contentious topic, especially, sometimes you want to check your ideas before you start putting them out publicly. There's
Sure.
plenty of ideas where I still have never voiced anything publicly because I'm still formulating,
Yeah.
Like if it's around a controversial enough topic, it's like, you don't want to just step in that minefield before you've really thought it all through. So I use it for that as well. But I agree. I think, I use it for my show notes as well. I don't know if you
absolutely.
guys do that, but it's amazing for that, because we're going to have a 2 hour, we're halfway through, but we're going to do 2 hours of conversation. After that 2 hours, I'm not going to remember everything we talked about. And if I were to formulate show notes, I'd have a subjective bias with it. With AI, it's like, just give it the transcript, let it kind of determine what the focus of the conversation was. Cause I'm not planning all my questions or anything, not like, oh, I need to focus on this or anything. So yeah, I think it's great for that. Like anything where you're feeding it the information, it's really, really cool. And
Absolutely.
I feel like it's pretty trustworthy in that sense.
Yeah, no, I would never displace good old fashioned, reading the article or the book. Absolutely. Got to do a lot of that still, but it can't be denied the productivity that you can gain. And it's funny because folks will get some upset because I respond to them using AI. And I said, I could write a 4-page response for you on this very complex topic because that's how much I need to respond to this. But I don't have that time right now on what is generally common knowledge. I don't need to tell you, I don't need to formulate a whole thesis and research paper on common knowledge. I can use AI that has all of my information concisely put together in, a 5-second output and just, pass it along.
Yeah. When it comes to editorializing, it's become more and more common. When I was even in high school, growing up, I just saw it more and more over the years. Like people don't want to just offer just the bland information anymore. They need to put their editorial in there, and sometimes it's even subtle. Like, yeah, one example is 2020 election. Trump was saying it was stolen, and every article. I mean, I don't think the election was stolen. I don't think so. I don't really know. I mean, anything is possible. I do think that the numbers are so big and it's such a complex thing that if there was cheating, I don't know if we'd ever actually know. I think if something like that happens and they get away with it, I just don't know if we can actually ever uncover it fully. But every article about it included the line like, Trump falsely claiming the election was stolen. And it's like, that word falsely is editorializing. Like, even if it's true that it's false, it's like Trump claimed that the election was stolen. Like, that's the actual news. Like, Trump is claiming the election was stolen. That's like, that is just without any editorializing. That's actually what's happening. But everyone needs to say falsely. And that's just one example, like, and it's way worse in other regards, like where people just need to kind of insert their opinion into everything that they write. Do you see that getting any better? Do you see it changing?
No, I do not. Unfortunately, I see us becoming more and more opinionated.
Yeah.
I think, and it's talked about in the book Nexus, we thought that more information would just make us more enlightened folks, and we'd become smarter and better critical thinkers, and our logical reasoning would improve. And I think we really underestimated the limitations of us being humans. We're humans at the end of the day. And we can't force some sort of evolutionary change quick enough. As much as X-Men is a great movie and series that I love so much, it's just not something that can happen in such a short amount of time. So really what's happened is we've increased the supply of information, and therefore it's become less valuable. Now, how do you create value? Editorialization, clickbait, rage bait. At the end of the day, these are mainstream media are very large corporations, but folks like you or I, there's the temptation for audience capture. I'm sure you feel it too. I feel it on our show. It would be so easy to just be, these unreal personas and just lean hard into our, left persona, right persona, and just argue, even if it's just fake online. But that would probably get in a lot of views, but it's disingenuous. And at some point, though, people often sell out their integrity for that paycheck. And if you've got a family to feed, I understand those pressures, but perhaps we can kind of try to, formulate a society that doesn't value that and actually values truth seeking. I don't know how we get there, and I'm sure it's a very long process. And I'm sure it starts with, instead of, preparing us for some workforce in the future for these jobs that AI is almost certainly going to take, maybe we really stress, philosophical, reasoning and how to create a logical argument. I think that was one of the most important electives I ever took in my college. It was like a philosophy 101 class, and it was just called logic, and it was how to formulate your argument. And it seems so simple, and people love to throw out, oh, that's a fallacy of that, or you're appealing to authority, this and that. But I don't think people really truly understand like how difficult it is to form a logical argument, how many traps there are, and that it's easy to fall into. So I'd say that's probably our best bet, is really just focusing on that.
Yeah, I mean, I consider myself pretty logical, but I'll find myself coming up with an emotional argument, or there's times where I'll have to admit, like, I'm just biased on this. I have a bias here.
Likewise.
We are human. We're very fallible. We are going to make mistakes. We are not going to see things right. And there's a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. Fantastic book. I'm like 80% of the way through it. But he talks about in-group bias. And we have, like, he talks about some car salesman. He's a Muslim guy, and he racks up insane business. I think this is in Michigan or something like that. And the book was
Okay.
written a while back, but it's like this. He leverages that in-group bias so well that he just racks up sales with it. But he also, the author goes into studies that show we trust information more from people we are politically aligned with. So if I feel politically aligned with you and you offer, like, let's say I have three people offering a potential answer to a fairly complex problem that's just not immediately obvious, not a simple math problem or something. If I feel more politically aligned with you, I'm going to trust your answer more than the other people in the room. Even if I know you have a worse track record for being right. It's kind of wild that our ability to differentiate truth from fiction is so distorted by our in-group bias. It's insane how prevalent that is in our minds.
Yeah, I mean, we're humans. I mean, we're
Yeah.
biased. That's just our nature. And that's the great challenge, right? Is always working against our biases. And often they're unconscious. So that's why it takes that's why you try to avoid in-group bias. So you can't eliminate your biases, but what you could do is try to surround yourself with folks that think different than you. I'd say the super majority of my friends are actually people who disagree with me pretty wholeheartedly. But it gives me such perspective because then there's ideas that I'm like, I know I'm wrong about. And then there's other ones that through our debate, no, I was like, no, I feel more confident about what I've talked about since, we had this discussion. So no, I do feel that I'm pretty correct on this, but you should not find yourself surrounded by yes friends, who just say everything that you do, because to me, variety is the spice in life. So I really do think you need to have some colorful debates in life, because also too, you shouldn't be the same person over time. If you're the same person you were in your 20s as you are in your 40s, excuse me, I don't know if I could curse on your show, but you're a
No,
pretty
go for
fucking
it.
boring person. So just bleep that one out.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because you hear people talking. I want to get back to who I am, or I want to. I'm not myself anymore. People say that sometimes, and it's like, are you supposed to be though? Like, should you be the same person you were 10 years ago? It's like, I think we kind of, especially us in like we're in the political realm to at least some degree. We're constantly reading news, absorbing information. I read a lot of dark books. Like I don't enjoy dark history, but I find it extremely important. Like Rape of Nanking, which is a horrible story. Like reading stuff like that, or Gulag Archipelago, whatever the book might be, exposing yourself to dark information, the dark realities, uh, opens up your eyes. But it can change your demeanor. It doesn't mean you're going to be like a negative person all the time, but it's like you look at the world a little bit differently when you know the reality a little bit better. And I think, ignorance is bliss, right? Like that's what people say. And it's like, I'd rather go for uh, knowledge and be a little bit less happy than just remain ignorant and be in bliss. I don't know. Yeah, I would assume you're probably the same in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a very despondent process, truth seeking, because it doesn't bring happiness. The revelations that you often discover are not the ones you want to find, and they usually don't lead to a utopia. Unfortunately, right? Reality is harsh and unfair, but that definitely formulates a lot of my personal beliefs and values, and that's why, even though I call myself a liberal, if I surrounded myself with liberals, I probably have more to disagree with them than I would have to agree about with them. So I just
Yeah.
think that's always something important.
Yeah. And another thing is like you touched on it earlier. There are people at the extremes. So like, Trump being kind of a main political figure in the US, you have two extremes when it comes to analyzing anything Trump does. And one is the TDS crowd who basically go into conspiracies and like everything is Trump's both an idiot and a mastermind trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. And then there's the people who Trump can do no wrong. He's basically a god to them, which is just as problematic because it's like, dude, you have to be able to criticize this guy when he does something wrong. You have to, and I understand their position to some degree. I think people who are overly defensive of Trump, some of them at least, I think they feel like he's been attacked so much that they don't want to give any ground to any attack on him anymore. And then there's some people who just, the guy is a god to them. I think it's important to find those people in the middle, whether they're right or left, doesn't matter. But those people who are looking for real, genuine conversation and genuinely curious. And I consider you a very curious person, Cooper a curious person. And I find myself resonating with people that are curious regardless of what their political leanings are, because it's like, if you're curious and you're going to give me some information, whether it's true or not, I would assume that you're giving me information that is as accurate to your mind as possible. And even if it ends up not being completely accurate, it's probably going to put me on the track to uncover some reality that I wasn't aware of before. But I think if you go to those extremes, then you're probably not going to get that, because it's just kind of an echo chamber of either adoration or disdain for a person or ideas.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, listen, there's no, it's obvious the right has their own, far right, and then the left has the far left. The progressives often give a bad name to the whole party.
Yeah.
So it's just as problematic as both sides. I have a lot of criticisms with the progressive end of the party, and it's not necessarily that I disagree with the policies, but more so the implementation. But also, too, is these ideals are so important to them, but they won't show up at the ballot box. Or if it's not exactly how they want it, it's kind of an all or nothing principle. So it's like, that's it, I'm not voting for you at all. And that's not how politics or society at large works. What makes our country so interesting is that we're kind of like a patchwork quilt, right? That's our unique advantage, is that we're not uniform. And it gives us such diversity of ideas and experiences that in theory should be leading to a, more holistic understanding of things, perhaps a moderated experiences, because we're trying to compromise with all these individuals. I do think our information channels are a bit erratic right now, and it's very hard for us to get, that uniform experience, so we can all kind of moderate ourselves with this information out there. But I think that should always be the end goal, is that you should be looking to compromise with individuals. But as you said before, is that we regard ourselves as curious individuals. It doesn't take, you could go on my Twitter page. I argue with many folks who are just not curious. They're not interested in actually listening to the information I provide. Vaccines has been a big thing for me the last several weeks, and talking about bias, it's because I have a new one in my life. So it's kind of very, front and center. And I've read a lot of the CDC guidelines, as well as even the research papers around these, just to make myself a more informed arguer. And I just think that people they mean well, and they really do think that they're, standing up for something. But I do think a lot of folks just don't understand how the world works. And that unfortunately comes with complex education. And perhaps that's really a kind of a segue into another conversation, is just our education system doesn't train us to be good humans, right? They prepare us for a workforce that's not necessarily really there on the other end of that 12-year journey that we go on.
Yeah, that's something I am very passionate about. The Austrian system is it was designed, and I'm sure you know this, it was designed to create good, obedient soldiers. And then it was implemented in the US to create good factory workers. That's where we go to school. We go to school to be
producer. Yeah.
subservient. But I do have to push back a little bit on something you said, because
sure,
with progressives, I actually think that they could be better served by sitting out of some elections. And one of the things, I used to consider myself progressive. I supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. Obviously, he lost to Clinton, and I think there was foul play there. I think it's actually objectively true that there was foul play. But what he asked progressives to do at that point was ignore everything that just happened and just back up Hillary Clinton. And I kind of reject that. And I maybe people disagree with this, but I see Trump as a disruptor on the right. Like he wasn't in 2016. It should have been Jeb Bush. I think that's who the party wanted to put in there as the candidate. I don't think they would have cared if Jeb lost to Hillary Clinton because they're kind of the same person in some ways. But I think Trump is a disruptor. I think he disrupted the Republican Party. And I
Oh,
think
absolutely.
whether you like Trump or not, I find disruption, especially in a, like I said, these corporations that are controlling our politics, I think disruption is good in those. I haven't seen disruption on the left in the Democratic Party too much. Like Obama kind of, but then he kind of ended up being way more establishment than people expected.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
when it comes to progressives, I feel like they, as much as the Democratic Party is going to push like Trump's Hitler and you need to just back us up and go with the Democratic vote and vote for a Democrat, you can only do that so many times before progressives are going to be like, well, when do we get our shot? When do we actually get a say and actually have some influence and not just have to back you up because you're convincing us that the other party is evil? But that rhetoric, it gets a little repetitive. So I think it's actually smart for progressives, if they want to reform their party, they have to let it lose, I would say. So I think not voting is actually a smart move for the long game for progressives.
I agree with you in a lot of things there. So I think, right, there's only so many times you could compromise as a progressive, like you said. And, when do you start putting some of our positions on the platform, or when do you start fighting for them more publicly?
Yeah.
Until then, you just keep taking our vote for granted, right? So at a certain point, I'm no longer going to vote for the party because it doesn't seem to represent anything that I want to see in my elected, representatives. It is unfortunate what happened to Bernie Sanders, because that's unfortunately the way the DNC works. Is we have these the super delegate system, right? So they're these non-voting, party elites who essentially can tip the scales in the favor of one candidate if they like them, and that's exactly what happened to Bernie Sanders. I would say that I'm thankful we don't have a parliamentary system in our country for all the
Yeah.
problems that our duopoly or two-party system has. I think a parliamentary system really highlights how dysfunctional government can become, because I like the way that our factions push their larger parties to move towards a certain position or not. But I think with parliamentary systems like in the UK or France, all of a sudden you could lose your prime minister from a snap election, and then you're really, could be whiplashing politics, which is almost what happened recently with, Le Pen potentially becoming
Yeah.
prime minister in France. But I think another point that you touched on is really important, is that you certainly learn a lot more from your losses. You don't learn anything from a victory, right? You take
Yeah.
your victory lap and you don't work on improving your game in any way because you feel I'm doing everything right. It will be interesting to see what happens to the Democratic Party, because one of my concerns was that Democrats, even though I want to see them win, is if they won resoundingly, these long-term structural problems in the Democratic Party would just get worse. So I do see a lot of the progressive end saying exactly what you're saying, as like, you've been taking our vote for granted anymore. And until you stop listening to the party elites who don't really represent the majority of Americans, then yeah, we're going to sit out each and every election until, we get at least some compromises.
Do you think the Democratic Party has the self-awareness to make those adjustments? It To me, it kind of doesn't seem like it right now, and even though I'm not supportive of Democrats right now, I would like to see a day where I feel a little bit more aligned with the Democratic Party again, because I think anytime you get kind of a monopoly of power where one party just starts fading away, is in a two-party system, I think you are headed for totalitarianism. So I think it's really important to have a healthy right and a healthy left, like really going at it, putting their best ideas forth, debating, and trying to find the compromise between the two sides. Hopefully without the extremes, but even if the extremes, hopefully they're just quiet extremes, not too prevalent in the party. I want a strong Democratic Party in the sense like I want them I want a populist Democratic Party, like a Democratic Party that's listening to the people, not seeing themselves as an authority to guide the people, I guess. This is the
I,
best way I can put that.
I think it's really important that we stop looking at each other, the opposing parties, as the enemy, and we need to
Yeah.
start treating each other as the loyal opposition. That's one of my favorite phrases, is because at the end of the day, they're supposed to challenge you and hold you accountable. So if our two-party system is going to work, we absolutely need both of them, challenging our leaders in power. My
Yeah.
hopes is that history repeats itself, or at least rhymes, is you usually see one party in office for a couple terms, and then people become dissatisfied with the results or what's been going on, and then they change things up. And although it seems like a discontinuity in our system, I think overall, with the long arc, because it kind of keeps us going in this general direction. Because without this, you do see countries kind of slip towards one end, be it a far left or far right totalitarian kind of regime. With ours, it's like everybody gets taste and power before the other one does, and then we switch back and forth, and it kind of keeps us in this middle road. Where the Democratic Party is going in this is kind of anyone's guess, because they are still tearing each other apart. I think it's still post-mortem time. I think they're kind of still
Yeah.
digesting it. I think once Trump has been in office for about 6 months, they'll kind of gear their strategy. Unfortunately, what the DNC is designed for, just like the RNC, is they're not designed to produce, quality statesmen and women who, do the best for our country. They're designed to win elections at any cost whatsoever. It doesn't matter how
Yeah.
bad the candidate is, as long as they can win an election. So unfortunately, I don't really see too many changes in that regard. I'm hoping that most Americans can kind of speak up, and like you said, maybe we'll see a little bit more of a populist emergence in the Democratic Party, because whatever message they were selling, this middle of the road, a little bit of everything, something for Republicans, a little bit for elitist Democrats, and a little bit for progressives, it fell spectacularly short, this election cycle. So they need to certainly restructure their messaging and their platform.
Do you see any potential disruptors like Trump on the horizon in the right, on the left? Like Trump, he had a unique set of characteristics. Like he was wealthy enough that if the party wasn't supporting him, he could use some of his own money. I think he did in 2016. He used a bit of his own money. I think now he uses more donations and stuff like that. And he's kind of overtaken the Republican Party. Like the Republican Party is Trump now, which I hope that changes over time too. Because just like the Bush era, the Republican Party, like we need change. Do you see anyone like that with that potential on the left right now?
I don't see too many people who are disruptors. Unfortunately, as I was mentioned before, like the way you advance in the DNC, just as you would the RNC, prior to Trump, is you toe the party line. You put in your time, and you support the establishment until one of the kingmakers like Nancy Pelosi or the others, the collection of super delegates, they'll decide it's your time, right? So I don't think right now there's a lot of disruptors. I hope that with enough of a Trump term, the conversation will get energetic enough amongst Democrats for us to hopefully seek different changes. I wish the Democrats would focus on their economic record more, because despite inflation, there's a lot of things that I think are really important to tout, which I think the biggest one for me, and I talk about it all the time, is the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act. So kind of tying back into the beginning of our conversation, those two pieces of legislation are really landmarks in U.S. history, and they were bipartisan. So whether you don't like Biden or you love him, they happened under his term, and Republicans, may have hated it because it was the Build Back Better deal just reformulated. They all rushed to enjoy those tax credits, which now have created either like the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company opening up inside the United States, all these, energy generation projects, be them battery backups or solar power, wind, nuclear, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also been a very it's been a non-discriminatory piece of legislation. So it just says if you can produce energy that has a lower carbon footprint, even if it is using hydrocarbons, we will use those cleaner technologies. And that really is just something we haven't seen since the end of World War II, where we invested in our interstate highway system. And I don't think anyone could, say that it hasn't paid its dividends back in the amount of commerce that we use it for, or even just luxury and, leisure and traveling around.
Sometimes when I hear the word bipartisan, I get a little worried because I think there's a lot of money laundering that happens through Congress. And sometimes bipartisan means the most self-serving agreed to write a bill that maybe their donors get kickbacks or they get kickbacks or something like that. So sometimes the word bipartisan doesn't
Sure.
resonate with me as a good thing, even though it should be. Like, I
Well,
think bipartisan is a good thing inherently, but or
what I will
supposed to
say
be.
is it was a Democratic authored bill, so it
Yeah.
was Manchin and Schumer, right? Two prominent Democrats. One more of a, I don't want to call him a maverick, but certainly someone who's not, a centrist or establishment Democrat, Mr. Manchin. But 80% or more of those tax breaks that were built into the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax breaks that would be given to these energy companies to open up in the United States or manufacturing companies, about 80% of them have landed in red states. So as much as they want to say that, it was a bad bill, they're the first ones to line up to, help these factories open up and create jobs within their state. So I will say it was bipartisan in the sense that the economic activity has been pretty well distributed.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I think it's funny because sometimes the rhetoric, Republicans have to be against something that was formed by Democrats and vice versa, but often the reality on the ground doesn't operate the way that their tongues are working. Like, they'll say something, but it's like, you seem to support it in action, but maybe not in words so much. So
So,
that's
so
really
here's a
interesting.
political prediction that I'll eat my hat if I'm wrong about. My expectations, because there has been a lot of criticisms either about the Inflation Reduction Act or the components of it that were the Build Back Better Act. I think you're going to see some targeted repeals of, say, like the electric car programs, unless Tesla, Elon Musk has a little more influence on that. But this was the big talking points from a lot of Republicans: is why do we need these subsidies for these electric vehicles anymore? Like, let them compete in the marketplace if they're really a better product. They'll probably only remove that little small sliver of the legislation, and in the grand reality of things, it's such a 1% of the bill, right? But it's a political victory. They were able to
Yeah.
repeal something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think when it comes to technology, there is a little bit of you can look at like the internet. We were one of the first countries to implement the internet, but we don't have the best internet right now. Like, other countries have way better coverage than we do.
Right?
And there's something to be said about biding your time a little bit as new technologies come out, because if you're
Sure.
the first to implement it and it takes a bit of infrastructure and resources, you tend to be lagging behind when the other countries catch up, even if they're not in as good of a position initially, because they benefited from all the mistakes that you made, all the technology and the research that you did in implementing that the base technology. Then these other countries come in and they're like, oh, well, we're going to implement this now too, but we're just laying the infrastructure now. We can have way faster internet, way more fuel efficient cars, whatever it might be. So sometimes I do worry that if we're incentivizing, I think it's good to incentivize technology and to incentivize like environmentally friendly technologies and stuff like that. At the same time, sometimes I worry that we're going to over incentivize and set up too much infrastructure before it's really at the stage where we should set up that infrastructure or make a move in that direction to the extent that the incentives would drive us.
So by incentivizing new technologies that we're trying to push here, be them solar or nuclear power generation, battery technologies, things like that, there's certainly risk that comes with that, right? So it's like the New York City subway situation, right? It was built in 1905, and it was the pinnacle of the world at the time. And it definitely has its problems now. It's the scope and the size and the upkeep of it is very, very difficult. But if we travel to, say, Europe or other countries, and you look at their metro system, you think like, I'm paying less, and this thing is beautiful, clean, and it gets me to all the places I need. It's because they were able to use, the mistakes that other countries have made and learn from them before they implement their technologies. I would say that one of our greatest advantages is being at the forefront of these technologies. So when something starts to become obsolete, it becomes cheap enough that we can sell to some other countries. And that's honestly what makes the American economy the powerhouse it is right now, is we sell our IT, either the services or the products, and it's usually like more legacy systems. But even now, it's kind of catching up to where other countries want to buy our bleeding edge, IT technologies. And that R&D is what kind of keeps you as the preeminent superpower, because it's not just the military technology or force that you have behind it, it's the economic power, because what wins you wars is your ability to sustain them if it really came down to that, and the stronger economy is going to win.
Yeah. You said you were looking into vaccines a bit recently. I'm curious. I saw one of your, I think you shared something about RFK or something like that being proven wrong about something. I can't remember what it was. I was looking at it right before the interview today. How do you feel about RFK? He's proposed to be in charge of the, I forget what department, but
I think,
it's like
is it Health and Human Services,
Health and
right?
Human Services. Yeah. So what do you think about him going into that position?
I think, and I'll definitely speak more specifically about RFK Jr. I think a lot of my criticisms with the appointments is that there's sometimes better folks that are put in another position that they should be somewhere else, with their policies that'd be more effective. I mean, there's things I like about what RFK Jr. is saying. I say clean up our food supply system, right? Let's take out a lot of the processed, things out of there. What other countries regard as illegal, because there's some risk profile attached to these food additives. I think one of the perfect examples is like some of our sodas. We can put brominated vegetable oil in it. It's like vegetable oil that's been treated with bromine. Yeah, sure. You look at a lot of the studies and it shows that it has a very, very low risk. But countries systems like the EU, they chose to take a precautionary principle, and you can't find that in any of their goods and stuff over there. I love to see that kinds of things, but my concern is the ancillary areas, right? So now, one of the biggest things that's really important to me is his position on vaccines. He says we need to take another look at them, and I mean, you ask anybody who's in the field, and it says, we've been looking at them for 50 to 70 years. We have an insane amount of data on vaccines. So not only do we have the preclinical trials, and just so folks know, is every vaccine, and including the adjuvants or the things that go inside them that help elicit immune response, all of these things undergo several preclinical trials, right? So these are like animal studies. Then they go through 3 phases of human clinical trials, right? So they're larger, as they go along. Okay, so the first 100 people in the clinical trial, it looks like it's okay and safe to use. We'll use a larger trial and then a larger trial. And then it goes through a post-regulatory review. Most folks don't trust the CDC, but there are many, many folks out there who are reading this research and determining if it's within an acceptable risk profile. But here's a large component of that most people don't know, is that the US has something called the VAERS system, and it's essentially a reporting system about the complications due to vaccines. So the US government has assumed the liability for any harm that results from taking a vaccine, that 1 in 1 million complication that might actually result in a more serious health event. The US government assumes that reliability. So we have this ongoing constant reporting system. And to just give you an idea, one perfect example of it finding vaccines that don't work well is we have the mRNA vaccines that stayed on the market for COVID-19, but the J&J vaccine, which uses an older form of attenuated viruses, was taken off the market. Some people, suspect conspiracy because it's an older technology, and the market and the powers that be only want to push these newer, potentially untested technologies. And it's simply because of the fact that through the VARS reporting system, there was more adverse events that were being reported, and out of a gross abundance of caution, it was removed from the market. So again, I'm not saying people to just, in whole cloth trust your government or all these institutions and stuff like that. But I think people should also understand exactly what's going on behind that. And then I wouldn't even be opposed to a review of vaccines. But this is the problem: is his lawyer. This is RFK Jr.'s lawyer, Aaron Siri. It's what a lawyer sees and not what, say, a medical professional sees. A lawyer just wants to win an argument. So it doesn't matter to him whether his information is truthful or not. He just wants to push this narrative that, we need to, take the polio vaccine off the market until we're sure it's safe enough. And I could just politely say that there's an abundance of evidence that shows that the polio vaccine is not only incredibly unsafe, but the one that we use is very, very effective. As you can see, that there's no one with polio in the United States, right?
Well, yeah, I feel like we should probably err on the side of data being correct. Like, if we have all this data behind us, I think it's a good thing. There are people who are very skeptical of certain vaccines still. And I think RFK being in that position is a chance for some of those concerns to be alleviated in the sense that like RFK's in there, he's aligned with your interests. He's a skeptic, or some people might say a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, that's kind of who I'd want dealing with our food supply. And I mean, because you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to know that there's something wrong with our food supply.
Sure.
And oddly enough, it's kind of funny that it's the right being open to looking at this, because we're actually trying to be more like a lot of left-leaning countries with our food. Like that's what we want to be like. Europe is largely left-leaning, but that's who we usually refer to when it's like, see, their food is better. And it's like, well, they also have a healthcare system that is more closely aligned with their food system. Like they have socialized medicine, and the government has an interest in keeping its people healthy because they have the burden of all the costs and stuff like that. But with RFK, I think it's kind of a good thing to have him in there as long as he's open to being proven wrong. If he goes in there and says, I'm right and I'm just here to prove that I'm right, that's problematic because that's not science. That's not how science works. But if he goes in there as kind of with a mind that's more aligned with science, where it says, I'm skeptical of all of these past studies because maybe there's some interests that are aligned that people don't know about, whatever it might be. I think it's good for him to go in there and say, we're going to restudy this, and I'm going to be in charge of the study and overseeing everything and making sure that I think it's done properly. I think it's a good thing if, regardless of which direction it comes out on, like if he's like, okay, vaccines are safe. I was wrong. Like these vaccines are safe.
I definitely can fully appreciate that point. I guess my hope, right, is I hope he sees the same thing in the evidence that I feel the people who are saying is, we have good evidence to show that vaccines are safe. I hope he comes to the safe conclusion, because if that gets more folks, and again, I don't want everyone to be vaccinated all the time. I just think that they should understand their risks and the protections that vaccines offer. And I would hope that most folks would choose them, and especially for their young ones. Yeah. But, I would hope that they come to that conclusion. So if more folks overall participate in it, and then more importantly, if we get a cleaner food system out of it, I'm not going to be complaining. I guess where here's my I get not criticism, but I just counterpoint would just be is that there's different mechanisms and levers that could have been more easily pulled to affect change. And it's not necessarily through the Health and Human Services, division, right? It's a similar nature with the whole immigration. You have like Kristi Noem, who's actually in charge or appointed, to be potentially. She doesn't have the experience to run such a large agency, first of all, but also most importantly in immigration law. But ironically, the border czar who was appointed by Trump, or potentially so far, that power is only advisory. And yet that person in there is probably, if you want a harder stance on immigration, someone who has experience doing the position before. And that's someone you would want at DHS, right? To be able to actually oversee that, because they've done it before and they already know exactly how to implement those policies. To me, it just seems a little inefficient to have that border czar then simply tell the DHS to do it. It just feels like a waste of time. And I think a perfect example, and this is something I learned recently, Cooper sent me on the Poisoned documentary. It's on Netflix, and actually is a really good insight into our food supply chain and the problems with it. In the early 90s, there was a Jack in the Box outbreak. I think it was either E. coli or one of those similar bacteria.
E. coli,
yeah, it was E. coli, right? It was like hemorrhagic E. coli too. It was really bad. So a few young ones unfortunately succumbed to really, really bad gastrointestinal diseases. They died, because of diarrhea, and that's just awful as a parent to have to go through. And it all sparked because Jack in the Box says we have no legal liability in this. There's no requirements for us to make our food safe, and that kind of should have really set us off and say, like, wait, what the heck is going on here? What do you mean you're not liable for the food that you cook? Like, who else is then? What else are you liable for, right? One of the things that they pointed out as a result of that event is the FDA labeled that particular strain of E. coli as a contaminant. And now it was regulated. And that meant that they could tell every food producer that you have to take precautions to prevent this contaminant from getting in your food before it gets to consumers. And unfortunately, with certain landmark cases since then, the Supreme Court has ruled that the responsibility is on the consumer to either order cooked food to a temperature or at home cook their own foods. And that's given a large pass to like the meat packing industry and a lot of these mixed greens, like the leafy vegetable industries, to say, well, yeah, we know our products have salmonella and E. coli on them, but that's your responsibility to remove them. There's not legal obligations for us, right? So that's kind of crazy to me, because talk about the EU is that there's products you can seek in your market that are rated pathogen free, that you know are assuredly safe. There is no salmonella on it. Or you can buy a product that may potentially be contaminated, but you know you're going to thoroughly cook it, right? Our world is filled with salmonella and E. coli's, but there's just a handful of strains that are really, really virulent and dangerous to us. It would be a matter of an overnight change to our food supply chain to make our meat and our mixed vegetables healthier and safer, to just simply label these things as contaminants. I don't know why, as consumers, we allow a certain amount of E. coli and salmonella on our foods, assuming we're just going to cook it away. To me, that's a little backwards.
Well, it's like the corporatism is so extensive in the United States, to the extent that the FDA and other regulatory bodies that we assume are there to protect us tend to actually be there to protect corporate interests more than the people. And it's just a huge problem. It's something that I really hope changes over the next 4 years. Like I really hope that, I mean, there's going to be some appointments of Trump's I don't like, for sure. And he's going to do things I don't agree with. But I like certain people being in positions where it's like, okay, maybe we can see this return to what it should have been in the first place. So like go back to like protecting people, because that's what all of these agencies are supposed to be.
Right.
That's what until you look into them, that's what you assume they are. Like
Sure,
EPA, FDA, like you assume these are like agencies that are there to protect us. But if you know enough, if you start looking into it, it's like, no, that's not what they're doing at all. Like a certain percentage of what they do does protect people, but it's like, then a huge percentage is just there to protect corporations. And there's that revolving door of like CEOs from pharmaceutical companies are constantly being over the FDA and all this kind of stuff. So I like having a skeptic in there. We'll see what happens.
You're 100% right about that. That's certainly a problem with it. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, again, this certainly be a little controversial, and I don't know if it's the solution, but there's been a suggestion that what if you paid these certain folks more who are in these agencies, right? Because you look at a lot of government workers, they're not rich. They're making, median U.S. salaries. So they're just like everybody else. I'm talking about the cogs in government. I'm talking about the bureaucrats who are sitting behind a desk. As much as we like to hate on these bureaucrats, they do a lot of work for us for very, very little money. So it is very, very tempting to go to private industry and say, hey, listen, I've worked at the EPA or I've worked at the FDA for 10 years. I know how it works. I have friends there. I can help you out. And then you go take a nice cushy salary there because it's more valuable. Yeah. Again, and it's a bit controversial, but I like to look at the example of Singapore and their president. They pay them very well. I think it's something like $1 million salary, whereas like our president, I think it's somewhere around like 150,000 or in that ballpark, maybe a little more, a little less. So anyone who takes the presidency will tell you that you spend way more than $144,000 a year. So folks may or may not know, when there's a state dinner, the president hosts foreign dignitaries or anything. We don't pay for what the president does, right? That he's not a king, or, she's not a king. If we ever have one of those, they're members of the public, so they have to pay for these foreign dignitary dinners and stuff like that. And that was something the Obamas learned very quickly, how expensive these things get, because it's like, holy shit, we have to pay. Excuse me, definitely have to bleep that one out again. Holy crap, we don't know how you actually pay for all this stuff. Again, I don't know if it's exactly the answer, but I think a large part of it is the incentive that once you join private industry, there's a lot of money to be made about knowing how government works.
I think the president might be higher. I think the president might be like 300,000 or 400,000.
It's been a while since I looked. I could be wrong.
It doesn't undermine your point at all, because it's still a very small salary when you're in that position, and that's the highest position in the U.S. So, yeah, I can understand what you're saying. I still think a lot of stuff needs to be cleaned up. So I think if we increase salaries, it also has to come with some caveats, like you can't go into the private sector in certain roles where your influence is being leveraged to influence the FDA or whatever the regulatory agency is. I think it would have to come with some like guidelines in that sense. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I
I
agree.
think
That
you're
sounds
right.
pretty good.
I think overall you're right. I think we need to incentivize people to,
Stay within
yeah,
and
yeah.
continue the mission, right? As opposed to, servicing yourself and privately.
Do you think like what they're doing with Doge will be end up being a good thing, like cutting down on the administrative state a bit and kind of cutting it down to the essentials, and then maybe rehiring what they really need to, kind of like what they did with X and Twitter?
So I think what you've seen so far is you see a lot of clickbait, rage bait stuff where they say, "Look, this is what we found. Look how many, much money they're spending on this thing." And I think when you just take one little like sentence and you say what the program was, but you don't actually look into what that actual funding or that research
Yeah,
does, it certainly sounds controversial. And I'd say, hey, I don't want my tens of thousands or even millions of dollars going towards that program. But our budget is public, like our federal budget. So I always challenge folks, right? So we have like a $6.2 trillion. Unfortunately, we pay more than what we take in with revenues, and it's about like a little over $1 trillion deficit. But I always challenge folks to go look at our budget, and you tell me where you can come up with $1.3 trillion in savings. I think it's incredibly difficult. I can't find more than like several $billion. I feel a lot of these programs are very, very important. I think once people get to Capitol Hill and they realize like, oh, this is the full scope of this program. Yeah, this is actually really important stuff. And the perfect example that comes right to my mind is Rick Perry. So he ran in the primaries against Trump but right before his first election. And his biggest thing was this gaffe where he said he wanted to eliminate the Department of this, and this. And the one that he forgot was the Department of Energy. And he said, oops, I can't remember. And then on a debate stage, right, that was a political gaffe that pretty much ended his
yeah,
career there. And the irony was that when Trump was elected, he appointed him to the Department of Energy. And then when he got there, he realized it wasn't some like top down, government agency that's telling states how to, run their infrastructures. He realized that they actually manage the entire nuclear stockpile and nuclear safety in the country. And that's where all the groundbreaking research in physics occurs, is under the Department of Energy. So yeah, they all sound good to, get rid of something because it costs millions and billions of dollars a year. But when you start to really look at things, they're much more important than we realize. And my personal belief is that's why I think we need to focus less on cutting and more on revenues. And then to speak to a point before is these appointments, they sound good, but I don't think they're going to work out in the long term, because a president can't create a department. He can only
yeah,
create an office. And an office only has advisory capacity. So that's why you've probably seen them talk about, we're only going to create the Doge for so long, and we're going to advise government up until this point. And then, to be efficient, we're going to just wrap up the project. It just seems a little bit redundant and or defeating the point of efficiency to create an extra panel with two people that are going to have staff that are going to draw government money on making advice to the Senate and Congress that actually has the power to create departments or make changes in the government. If you have confidence that the Republican majorities in Congress will go along with these, then yeah, that might be a good plan. But you also have to deal with realpolitik. Like, are you going to be able to get Congress to actually go forward with all of this cutting? And another example that comes to my mind is a lot of folks like to talk about, we send money to all these countries. I think people don't realize that the U.S. aid program, as it's called, the acronym, it's only something like $50 billion. So in a $6 trillion budget, even if you got rid of every penny, all you're going to do is upset a lot of our allies, who then will look to China and other countries for, external investment. And we will have effectively saved no money in the long run, so that
yeah.
to me, that is kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, I really appreciate your nuanced take on all this. It's really enlightening. I did ask Cooper, and I got to ask you. You guys are coming at your podcast. You have, I'm sure, some overlap, but you have differences in perspectives. Have you seen yourself like come closer politically, rather than drift apart since doing the podcast?
Oh, absolutely. We kind of pull each other towards the center a little bit, right?
Yeah.
my younger years, I was a firebrand progressive. I mean, if my old Twitter was active from when I was in, Hofstra many years ago, I was, very much more progressive than I am today. And like I said, if you put me in a room full of liberals, I'd probably have more to disagree with them about than I would have to agree with them about. I think it's important. That's why you need to surround yourself with people that disagree, and never put politics first. You maintain the friendships regardless of politics. Politics can't be your end all be all. And I think that's really important because we lose track of that. We fall into, these narratives that are comforting for our worldview, but then we become, so opinionated, we can no longer function as a society. And then we only surround ourselves with people who agree. And to me, like I said, that's a very boring life. I love arguing, and you could ask any one of my friends. That's all I do all the time. But at the end of the day, it challenges each other, and we all come towards some sort of different understanding.
Yeah, I love to hear that. And I think that's a reason why people should have more of these conversations just in their personal lives. After Trump won, I saw some people saying, basically calling half the country racist and stuff like that. And it's like the word worldview came to mind. It's like if you need to call all of your friends and family racist to preserve your worldview, it's probably not your friends and family that are the problem. It's probably your worldview being a little bit too extreme, and like it's like there's just differences of opinion. Like people didn't vote for Trump. I mean, most people didn't vote for Trump because they're white supremacists or want something of that sort. It's like it's policy, it's immigration, it's various things like that. So it's good to have people who are different than you but can explore ideas in a civil manner, because then you don't have to adopt their views or anything like that, but you can learn from them. And I think in general, it's going to cause us to be a little bit more aligned. And I think you've said this on your podcast, like we're more alike than we are different in general. And I absolutely believe that. I think there's way more that we have in common. And it's like politics is an atmosphere where the people in charge of parties and newspapers and stuff like that, they put wedges there intentionally. They want to have these divisive issues discussed in divisive ways because that gets a reaction. It gets attention, it gets clicks, it gets all that. So I think what you guys are doing is amazing. I really respect it. And on top of that, I really enjoy listening to your podcast. I've interviewed a number of podcasters at this point, and I've enjoyed a lot of people's podcasts, but yours is one that I will listen to. I will continue to listen to, and potentially steal some guests from you, like reach out to some after, because you get some really cool guests.
If you need us to put in a good word, absolutely, we'll make an introduction for you. And thank you so much for the honor of hosting me on your show. I really appreciated it. I wish I had more time these days as a parent of a 3.5-month-old, but I am going to get to more of your podcasts in the next year. I only have a couple under my belt, but I really appreciate everything that you're doing too, because it's all about restoring this discourse, and it feels fruitless. It feels like an uphill battle at times, but I keep reminding myself, if I don't do it, who else is going to try to make amicable agreements? So I really appreciate you for being another kind of person like that out there to just restore the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I love to ask people about books, and you're a reader. What are some books that have really influenced you in your life?
Definitely the Yuval Noah Harari series. Those first 3 books I'd recommend. They've been very profound. Carnage and Culture by Victor Davis Hanson, a more conservative, and perhaps you'd probably call him like a neoconservative, or maybe, I don't know, he's evolution, but either or. It's not someone who would identify as a liberal. You typically probably hear them say as one of the most profound books or impacts, rather, this book has had on my life. But it's really highlighted for me, the values and it's not an ethnic or racial superiority, but the West has been so successful, both militarily, economically, and politically, is because our civics are superior. It's the things that we talked about before. It's difficult democracy. It's very, very hard making a republic work, but it ultimately seems to be the best system because in the long term, authoritarian regimes are usually cults of personality that can't last more than a couple generations, and all the while, very inequitable treatment of the folks under it. So I look at that, and it really reminded me, and I guess, talking about from my progressive past, I was much more critical of Western society. But then, reading a book like that makes me realize, like, no, we actually have it pretty good here. As crappy as it is sometimes, these challenges are important. It's what makes us a more robust society. And then, those are probably the biggest things that have the most impact on me, I would say.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing those. Well, Mike, I've really enjoyed our time together today. Before we wrap up, can you tell listeners where to find you, where to find the podcast, anything else you want to share today?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to elevatedthoughtspod.com. That's our website, and you can find all of our episodes uploaded there. Similarly, you can find us on YouTube, and we're also on X as well, so you can find them all under the same moniker, Elevated Thoughts, and then I'll give you some links so you could post them in the description down there.
Awesome. Mike, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, Artie.